Hello friends, welcome back to our lecture series on public transportation, specifically on bus transportation. So, in the previous lecture we introduced you to the different types of bus stops, buses, bus stop design, bus stop location, and in this lecture we are going to now utilize all of that knowledge to introduce you to the bus service planning guidelines. So, now we will introduce you to how to plan for a bus service with the previous knowledge of what are the different types of buses, where the bus stops can be located, what is the spacing, so on and so forth. Finally, once we introduce you to the planning guidelines, we will tell you what are the different types of performance indicators that are used to evaluate how well a bus service is operating, the different financial quality of service indicators. Okay. So, these are the 4 broad steps in which you can plan for a bus service. In order to plan for a bus service, you have to plan for, or you have to have a service pattern, you have to have service levels, you have to determine whether you need new routes, and you also have to take care of passenger comfort and safety. So, broadly the 4 steps in planning for a bus service are these. Now, we will look into individually what these 4 steps tell you. So, remember these are again guidelines. So, we will be going through specific examples of each of these, but these guidelines have to be taken in and adapted for your local needs. So, guidelines, that is why they are called guidelines, they are not standards or they are not a law or anything that you have to abide by, but these are guidelines. So, the first one is service pattern. So, what do we mean by service pattern? There are 5 different ways you can understand what we mean to say when we say service pattern. The first thing is service area and route coverage. So, in order to plan for bus service, you have to know your service area, so that you can coordinate between the different operating agencies, authorities, so on and so forth. Because your service route or your service network may cross jurisdictional boundaries, municipal boundaries, and so on and so forth. So, you have to be aware of your service area for which you are introducing the bus service. Next, the route coverage, meaning what is the population density, what are the major employment centers, residential areas. So, you have to identify all that in beforehand before you start planning for your bus service, right, because population density plays a huge role in the success of a bus route. If there is high population density, the bus routes are usually successful. If there is low population density, they are usually not that successful. Successful meaning you may not the benefit to cost ratio may not be that high, and you have to understand where your major employment centers are and major residential areas are, so that you can connect them efficiently. So, that is what is the first item under service pattern, which is service area and route coverage. Next, you have to understand what is the structure of the route and the spacing. So, we have already looked at different route structures such as grid, radial, you may remember from the last class. So, now you have to understand which network or which route structure to pick. Okay, that will be decided heavily by the existing road network in the city, but also at the same time by understanding where your population, how your population density is spread out in the city, as well as your major employment and residential areas. Then finally, in the second step of route structure and planning, route structure and spacing, you have to understand how widely or closely spaced your bus stop should be. So, even we have learnt about this in the previous lecture. In the urban areas, usually your spacing should be less, because the population density is always higher in the urban areas, whereas in the suburban areas your population density may be lower and your spacing can be large. The next thing to plan for is route directness or simplicity. What is in the guidelines, what is advised is that the route directness is measured in a way that any route should be less than 20% longer than a car travel time, right, because your bus is a direct competition to your private vehicle or car. So, the route that the bus takes should be no more than 20% greater than the car travel time, because with the car you can travel point to point, whereas with the bus you cannot travel point to point. So, there is a leeway that is given that 20% higher travel times can be there on the bus, but anything more than 20% usually you would see that people shift towards using their own private vehicles or cars. Also simplicity in the sense no more than 2 branches per trunk line. So, if you have a trunk and feeder system, do not make it so complex that each of the feeder system have multiple branches again. So, no more than 2 branches per trunk line is advised. You would see that the spacing of the route networks are shown in the figure, and also the route directness is shown. The route directness, it is usually advised that all the circuitous connections should be closer to the residential areas or the suburban areas rather than at the CBD, whereas at the CBD it should be very the route should go to one point and everybody should load or board or deplane from the one side. And route spacing also, if it is a suburban area, it can be spaced as high as a mile apart, whereas if it is very close to an urban area or to the CBD, usually routes are spaced much closer, less than a half a mile apart. Next point to remember in the service pattern is route length. It is usually said that it should not exceed 25 mile per round trip or a 2-hour round trip. So, when you are planning for any particular route, it should not be so long that it is greater than a 2-hour round trip, taking into consideration all the speeds and the congestion on the route, because if it becomes too longer, it is difficult to maintain their schedule because of the operating conditions. Then route duplication, one route per arterial. Usually any arterial road should not have too many competing bus routes, then it becomes very difficult operationally. One route per arterial is something that is recommended in the guidelines. This can be however changed for different cities, but you have to keep this in mind. So, the guidelines are telling you that these are the points that you should keep in mind while planning for a bus route. You may have, maybe your city is so dense that you do require 2 routes per arterial because there are too many boardings, such as for example, here also it is said that when you approach a CBD you may have multiple routes, but the point to be understood or kept in mind is that you have to understand or know about route duplication. So, that was all about service patterns. Now, the next thing to remember while planning for a bus service is service levels. So, what do we mean by service levels? Again, there are 5 different points. First thing is service period. So, you should plan for different types of service periods. There are regular service periods that you plan for. There are nighttime service periods which are known as owl service periods. Then there are suburban feeders. So, when you are planning for your route, you should not plan, not have a one size fit all kind of a situation. You have to plan for different service periods. We have already introduced you to what are policy headways. So, that is the minimum frequency, minimum service frequency that one should have. It is usually recommended that for peak urban period, no more than 20 minutes between buses. That seems to be very high anyhow in our case, but this is for one particular bus line or one particular bus route. Now, an arterial or a collector may have multiple bus routes, and so it may seem that the frequency of the buses are very high, but this is talking about one particular line. Then you have to plan for loading standards. What do we mean by loading standards? How many people are getting on and off the bus and how many people are able to sit versus stand on the bus. So, you would say that usually it is recommended that in the peak 30-minute they should have 150% boarding, that means 150% loading, that means there may be a lot of people standing on the bus as well, whereas during midday and evening peak you would say that the loading standards are lower. So, this is an example of how you would design for a fleet size depending on the loading factor and depending on the loading factor and the bus size. So, if you know the bus size, if you know the headway and if you know what type of bus has what capacity, then you could say how many passengers per hour per direction. So, PPHPD is passengers per hour per direction. So, how many passengers a standard bus that has 70 seats, the loading factor of 70% and say has an headway of 60 seconds. So, every minute a bus comes, then you can have 2940, approximately 3000 passengers per hour per direction. So, that gives you an idea of how you can plan for your bus service. The next thing to remember in service levels is about bus stops. Now, we have already introduced you to different types of bus stops. So, and bus stop frequency or spacing between bus stops. So, you have to keep all those in mind when you are planning for your bus service in your particular city. The next thing to remember is route speed. Usually, we would see that route speed changes from increases from as you go from CBD to the suburban areas, and some general patterns are given here. The last thing to remember is service reliability. Now, this is something that many passengers who want to take buses are always wary about, that the service is not reliable. So, you may set some reliability standards and check them from time to time. For example, during peak period, it is said that 80 to 100% of the buses should be no more than 3 minutes late. So, that gives you a very good service reliability, whereas during off peak you can say that little bit more or little bit less number of buses can be a little bit more number of buses can be late, because it is an off peak time. These are again, please remember, these are guidelines which you may change according to your needs of the city. The next thing to remember in service planning is how to incorporate new routes. So, all the time there will be requirements from different types of organizations, citizens, politicians, that please add a service to this new area or please increase the frequency of the buses. So, when you are trying to plan for such new routes, how do you plan for them? You first have to evaluate, then have to set some service criteria, and then have to look for a minimum experimental time period during which you will put the service and see how well it is doing. Okay. So, you have to look at physical constraints / street patterns. So, when you are trying to add a new route, you need to see if the street can accommodate your fleet of buses that you have. Maybe you have large articulated buses and these streets are narrow. So, the buses cannot turn easily in those streets. So, in that case you have to look for smaller buses. So, that is the point made here. You have to then estimate ridership and costs. Of course, everybody needs it, but can the demand support your costs? And then you have to compare it against existing performance. Usually what is the guideline says that you have to have a minimum population density of 2000 people per square mile, and the ridership should at least be 20 to 25 passengers per bus hour. So, bus hour meaning the hours that the bus operates. On average, every hour there should be at least 20 to 25 passengers, and the direct fare should cover about 50% of your service cost. So, if the fares are not covering 50%, that means the demand is not enough or the population density is not enough to get you a new route. However, some things to remember is that you should not very often make changes to bus routes. It is usually said that no more than 2 to 3 times a year major changes should be made. Minor changes are fine, but major changes such as adding new routes, increasing the frequency should not be done much, and always have a experimental time period during which you are testing out this new service to see if it is working out. If not, it has to be reverted back. Finally, you have to look at passenger comfort and safety. So, when it comes to passenger comfort and safety, there are several items that one has to plan for. For example, passenger shelters. So, do you need a shelter and benches on your at your bus stops? Usually, what is recommended is that if the stop serves more than 200 to 300 boarding or transferring passengers, you need passenger shelters, and all CBD stops need passenger shelters. What is the schedule for bus maintenance? It is said that the spare buses should not exceed 10 to 12% of your scheduled fleet. So, you should not have more than 10% of buses that are just spares because you think that maintenance will be required and these will be used. So, if you have more than 10 to 12%, then you are actually not efficiently managing your bus system. And there should always be the other guideline is there should be at least 5,000 mile scheduled maintenance. So, these are scheduled maintenance, not maintenance that are generated out of wear and tear, but these are scheduled maintenance. So, there should be at least 5 of them per thousand miles driven. What about bus route and designation signs? Many a times people standing at the bus, if you are people standing at the bus stop do not know how many routes serve the bus stop, especially if you are new to the area or new to the city, you do not have much information, and it is doubly problematic when maybe the bus network does not have a website or something like that which people can check. So, always have a sign that at the bus stop at least showing the route number and the destinations that bus stop is serving. Passenger information service, like I said, at least there should be internet based information, and also for people who are not internet savvy, they should at least have a telephone information system available that can tell you, or a person can tell you when is the next bus or what is the schedule of the bus, and these are standards that you can have differently for different agencies. This is an example of that says that 95% of all the telephone calls should be answered within 5 minutes. So, if you have standards like that, then you can always compare against it and see whether your bus service is doing well or not. Always have route maps and schedules, and always date them, because if you are changing or adding schedules or changing routes or adding new lines, people can be misguided by something that you have printed or something you have on the net which is older. So, always have a date on your route maps and try to have at least one a year printed. Schedules should be always printed a little bit with more frequency, because you may have schedule changes more frequently. Driver courtesy is something that has to be trained. Good training has to be given to drivers, as well as incentive programs have to be developed, because if the drivers do not have enough incentive, it becomes very difficult to run a bus service, say for example during the weekends or during the night time. So, they have to have some incentive programs. And lastly, there has to be good security systems on the buses for both passengers as well as revenue collection, because the buses may collect a lot of money, and that it is prone to theft sometimes. So, exact fare should be encouraged, and this is why Many bus systems are now moving towards fare cards rather than dealing with cash, because people do not have exact change. That makes boarding and alighting very difficult. And there are other safety features such as emergency alarms and security personnel at the bus stops or transit stations. So, those are broadly the 4 steps that you have to remember or take into account while you are planning for your bus service in your city. This kind of flow chart wise gives you the same information. So, you input all the data that you have planned about bus stops, types of buses and everything. You identify what other modes are running on the route. You select a route type. You know your existing street network, you know your which route alignment on which streets your bus would run. You would estimate, based on that you would estimate what how many people would ride your buses. You know your origin destinations. If your alignment is suitable, then you evaluate your network, and that is, if your alignment is not suitable, then again you go back and select new routes and redesign the network. This is kind of a snapshot of how do you do the route planning process. Finally, once you have a route in place, you have to have certain performance indicators that you can measure how well the route is doing. So, there are usually 3 different types of performance indicators that we look at. One is operational, one is financial, and one is quality of service. Operational performance indicators involve passenger volume, fleet utilization, breakdowns, fuel consumption, staff to bus ratio, accident rate, etc. So, these are all very self-explanatory and are explained in these slides. So, passenger volume, you want to know how many total number of passengers per bus per day your system is carrying. If they are doing well, that means and you are collecting enough revenue, then you are doing pretty well as a service. Capacity utilization is occupancy ratio, that is the ratio of passenger kilometers realized to the seat kilometers offered. So, you may have lot of seats available, that means your fleet may be large, but there are not many passengers that are using those seats to travel longer distances or travel distances. So, remember, passenger kilometer does not only mean passengers, it means how long a passenger travels. So, passenger hyphen kilometer. Okay. So, 0.8 is a ratio that is desirable. So, these are again guidelines, desired guidelines, which you can set for your own bus system. Fleet utilization, percentage of buses operated in peak period with reference to the total fleet. The peak period, you usually say that 90% of the buses should be at least utilized, otherwise your fleet is too less. Breakdowns should be less than 5% of the fleet strength. Many buses should not be breaking down. These are all operational performance indicators. Okay, these are all operational performance indicators. Fuel consumption for a normal city lies between 24 to 26 liters of diesel per 100 kilometers. Again, you can set your own consumption limits, but this is based on data from several cities that are collected. Total staff per operating bus or per operating bus. Okay. So, this, because now this is a very important ratio, because you have a lot of people involved in operating a bus system. So, this is usually said that the administrative staff should be only around 0.3 to 0.4 per operating bus. That means for almost two buses you can have one of administrative staff, whereas maintenance staff you have to have a bit more. Okay, 1 to 1.5. The accident rates are usually very less for buses, usually 1 accident per 100,000 bus kilometers. So, that is why bus is one of the safest modes to travel, and also the dead kilometers should be very less than 2% of the total distance travelled. Remember, the dead kilometers meaning the kilometers that the bus runs when there are no passengers on the bus. Moving on to financial performance indicators, you would see that the first performance indicator is operating ratio, which is the ratio of total revenue to total cost. that is easy to understand, how much you have collected as fare revenue versus how much cost is incurred to run the service. The next is fare box ratio, which is the ratio of revenues through sale of tickets to total operating cost of buses. So, sometimes you get revenues through non-sale of tickets as well. For example, you may get revenues through advertising on the bus. You will see a lot of advertisements pasted on the bus. So, you may get revenues through that. Whereas, fare box ratio tells you how much revenue you get through the sale of tickets to the total operating cost of the buses. Similarly, there are other financial performance indicators which are easy to measure: earnings per kilometer of bus operation, cost per kilometer of bus operation, and cost per passenger kilometer. So, these are again different indicators that are used to understand how well your bus service is performing. Lastly, quality of service performance indicators. This takes into consideration, performance indicators takes into consideration what the public thinks about your bus service, right. So, there are different quality of service surveys that are done, where people are asked, or the public is asked, what do they think about passenger waiting time, what do they think about the walking distance to the bus stop, passenger journey time, the need to interchange between routes, and the affordability and reliability. So, these are different indicators that tell you how well people perceive that the bus service is doing. So, the acceptable waiting time, for example, has a range between 5 to 15 minutes. Bus is said to be punctual if it arrives within plus or minus 5 times of the schedule. So, this is what people perceive, right. If the bus is more than 5 minutes delayed, people perceive that the quality of service is not good. Maximum walking desirable distance is no more than 300 to 500 meters in dense urban areas. So, we have seen that already. This can be helped by bus stop spacing. So, if the bus stops are spaced very close to each other in the urban areas, the dense urban areas, then people would have to walk very less, and they would then rate the quality of the system very high. So, that concludes our lecture or this lecture. In this lecture, we have shown you the different steps that are involved in bus service planning guidelines. They are essentially service patterns, service levels, new routes, and passenger comfort and safety. And we have also introduced you to different performance indicators that allow you to test how well your service is doing. So, they are operational, financial, and quality of service performance indicators. These are some references along with the textbook. Some material is taken from a research report which is available freely online and can be downloaded. Thank you very much for your time.